Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast with your host, Glenn Schmeltzley. Let's get into today's show.
Hey, Glenn here, and welcome to Funnel Reboot. This is the show for analytically minded marketers. Today, we're going to get some fresh insights on a platform that we should all be using. Let's get into today's show. The current version of Google Analytics, GA4, has been out now for 3.5 years. And yet, for many of us, it still feels kind of foreign. In fact, since it replaced Universal Analytics, the tool hasn't remained static. There have been updates to GA4 since the retirement of Universal in mid-2023. And even if you're not the expert in GA4 in your group, there are ways that you need to use it to give you the information you need. Things like leveraging the reporting library that surfaces just the data that you have to have. It's time to give GA4 a fresh look. And you're not alone. You should also know the analytics community at large is helping to demystify GA4 so it becomes more familiar to us. One person who creates great GA4 resources is a person who has spent decades getting ready for this. Dana DiTomaso embarked on her digital marketing journey over 20 years ago. She started working in a CRM company before founding one of Canada's first web design companies in the early 2000s. Clients asked her how these sites that she made could get more traffic. That propelled her into the world of SEO, and she became an active participant in the SEO community. And as an SEO consultant, she helped her clients in the search rankings with none of them ever facing a Google penalty. Recognizing the potential for how to do marketing this way, she expanded into founding 3 businesses. As the founder and lead instructor of KP Playbook, she teaches the Analytics for Agencies course and manages a learner community, emphasizing proven principles over quick tips. You will also catch her on many conference stages talking about analytics and how it can really be put to use for marketing. Let's go join her at her home in an old growth forest near Victoria, BC. Here's Dana DiTomaso. Dana DiTomaso, welcome to Funnel Reboot.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I am really glad to have you. 2 Canucks here on the show. Crazy.
We'll say out and about and talk about poutine and all those stereotypical things, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, eh? So we, sure, now that, everybody, if you want, yes, make fun of the accent, and but try really to listen to what Dana has to say. So Dana, we're going to be talking here about Google Analytics. The current version that we all have is Google Analytics 4. And rumor has it that you have gone around and you're handing out and plastering stickers saying, I love GA4. Would you please tell me what that's about?
Well, they started out kind of as a joke. I was going to a conference that we were going to be talking about analytics, as I do quite often. Yep. And we were thinking about handing out some stickers. And so I honestly don't remember who in the team had the idea, but there was I Heart SEO, I Heart PPC, and then there was an I Heart GA4. And people had such strong reactions to it. And we handed them out even before GA4 was like the complete switchover happened.
Yep.
And people had very strong reactions to them. And so I started calling them aspirational stickers. I would say, after this talk, you will want to put this on your laptop.
Okay.
And I would get tweets of people who crossed out the heart and then stuck it on their laptop. Some people would be like, I can't even look at this sticker. But other people, honestly, especially after I do a workshop, they'll be like, yes, okay, I feel like I can take the sticker now. I get it now. I think that's the big thing with GA4 is that people hate change. And I think GA4 came out at a time where everyone's kind of tired of this. We had this big global pandemic thing, It's a
Yeah,
stressful
I
time
heard
in the
about that.
economy. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot going on. And then you're like, oh, and now I have to learn a new analytics platform. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. So I think that's part of people's really strong reaction to it is just, this is a thing that I know and I use. And you probably didn't love universal analytics. You just think you did because you were annoyed at GA4. But now I hope that people will start to use and eventually, at least tolerate GA4 because we're stuck with it now.
This is true. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that you rightly point out is UA was a mature product. And so you got to be fair. You cannot take a product which is like in human years, it would be a toddler and, GA4, and you can't hold it to the same standard. One
No.
must,
Unless
one
you were
must hope.
using
Yeah.
unless you were using Analytics Classic like back in, 2006, then we
Ugh.
can have a conversation.
Yes. Yeah,
But yeah, it was a different product back then. And if you were only
for
using
sure.
Universal Analytics in the past few years, then you would not remember what it used to be like.
Yes. Yeah. And so they're doing this. They're building it on top of a new model. And while none of us know what back in the Googleplex they have as designs for developing the product, one can imagine that at least the engineers inside of Google, at least the ones who have to deal with large enterprises, are getting their ear bent and are understanding that if they make those changes and roll it out in the entire product, that even the SMBs will benefit from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the changes they've made quite recently at the time of recording this, like for example, they recently announced that they're going to be getting rid of signals showing up in reporting.
Yep.
Before you could filter it out, but not a lot of people knew to click that, and so you'd end up with these thresholding errors in your data. And now they're just going to remove that capability entirely, which I think is the right choice. And I think it's something that it's as close as I think Google may come to admitting that maybe they made a mistake by including that by default in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's smart of them to get rid of that, and that's going to happen in February 2024.
Yeah, good point. The Signals to me is just one of a cadre of things in this tool that really drive home that this is for, us with our big boy and big girl pants on.
Mm-hmm.
The information that we are looking at is being, it's from a database. There is a lot of nuance to what kinds of pieces of information about the users are able to be stored in it. There are recognitions of how touch points may or may not register back with the first visit. There are even dimensions that kind of bring us into that, where some are event scoped and some are user scoped. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is a lot more than just, oh, I want to see a line graph of things over time. No, this is now we're handing you full-fledged, grown-up level database information with a front-end UI.
Yeah, and I think even what you mentioned about scopes, those sorts of things existed in UA, but they were more hidden.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that really engendered mistrust in GA4 was people being like, "Well, this data doesn't seem correct." It was never correct. You just can see it now. I think
Yeah.
I think GA4 is more transparent in many ways, which
That's what I mean by
almost is
grown-up.
yeah, you've just sort of really you've taken the scales away from people's eyes. They're like, "Oh no, this is horrible." Well, it was always horrible. You just didn't know it was horrible. And I think that that's what GA4 actually does a really good job of, and something that I'm happy about. And I get why they're doing things like the data driven conversions, where it's assuming certain things based on what they know people are going to be doing.
Yeah.
That's great, but also most small businesses aren't necessarily understanding what the differences are. And so I think over time, as the Google Analytics team sees what people are using, because this is part of it too, it is a brand new product. The people who adopted it early are the nerds, and now everybody has to use it. So now, as they see usage statistics and see what's important and see what's coming in for bugs and what's happening, like they'll know over time what features need to be prioritized. And I think one of the big ones is improving their documentation, which they've published a lot of new stuff. And I think it's going to be happening. But then there's some other stuff too that's a little bit weird. Like, for example, I don't know if you remember a few weeks ago. So I'm talking about November at this point,
Yes.
mid-November possibly. they briefly put out something saying that conversions were going to be renamed to key events
Oh
unless it was
yeah.
from Google Ads, and it would still be a conversion.
Yeah.
And I made a video about it, and then I think within 4 hours of me noticing it, and I mean, I'm Pacific time. I always am the last person to get the news, but it went away, and they just deleted the page, and they haven't talked about it. So I feel like there's also still some internal weirdness going on, and I think partially that's because, in my understanding, the analytics team is under the ads team.
Right.
And I don't know if that's the right place for them to be sitting. I get why they are, because obviously all roads at Google lead to ads revenue. But at the same time, I think it means that they might be making, pardon me, weird decisions.
Correct. So so let's talk about that for a minute, about who is the right person to be looking at your Google Analytics. I think if that kind of stunt were pulled back in the days of universal analytics, I hate to say it, but I would think that most people would just look at it and not know. There might be those, small group of hobbyists / professionals that are screaming, but they wouldn't be heard amongst the many, who are just looking at it and taking it at face value. I feel like with GA4, there's this like self-selection going on, and I'm not sure I like this, but the people who are gravitating to GA4 are saying, okay, there are some new things in here. I see that they are trying, like another example would be multi-channel reports, throwing those under advertising. That I'm seeing a analytics product that very clearly bridges to an ad product, but it's on me to kind of know the data model and understand what they're doing, so that when I'm working for my company, I can untease that, I can unbundle that to give the right answer, or as close to a right answer as I can.
Yeah, I think the fact that the multi-channel reports are under advertising, even if you're not running ads, is probably my favorite part of GA4. Like on the ridiculous scale. And
Yeah.
there's no actual, ads reports under that section.
Nope.
It's just multi-channel stuff. It's not like here's how your Google ads are performing. And it's such an interesting, if you integrate Google Search Console, you get a collection of reports you can add. It talks about Google Search Console. If you have Google Ads connected, that's just Google Ads connected, period.
Right.
And it's
Right.
so interesting that that's the choices that they've made to say advertising, and which I get that they're like, well, SEO is kind of advertising too. Well, is it? And but if you say advertising, people aren't thinking, oh yes, I wrote content on my website. Well, technically, I guess it is. That's not the point here, and I think that they maybe are, on purpose missing the point. That advertising section as well is also kind of half baked. I feel like that's one of the areas that we're going to see some improvements in 2024. We have to. It's
Yes.
so tiny and weird right now.
What would you like to see?
Well, first off, I'd like it to see just talk about Google Ads and then take the multi-channel stuff and integrate it with reports. I think the reason why it lives in advertising those multi-channel pieces and not under reports is you can't customize those reports. Yeah. And anything that's in the reports menu, you can customize. So it's probably why it's sort of living off on its own little planet. But I also don't know why we don't have these pieces accessible to us in the reporting interface. So I suspect there may be features, to make this available in reports, and then advertising will get an overhaul, as I suspect what the order of operations might be there.
Sure. Okay. We're going into a very interesting area here, because I think the interface beguiles people, in part because they think that those items on the left-hand side are like what we saw in Universal Analytics. Just they're each one of them is a canned report, but it's from a different vantage point. And I don't know about you, but I couldn't disagree more. I see each one of those left menu items as being like a whole product unto itself. And you've got to, once you delve in, what your screen is about to do will be completely different depending on which one of those items you're inside.
Yep, I totally agree. And I think almost as a UI, this was almost a UI accident. I think that if they had instead put home, reports, explore, and advertising across the top, and then had the menu on the left for like the sub options that you've chosen, then it
Yeah.
wouldn't have the same, visual comparisons to Universal Analytics, which
Yeah.
is why they probably changed it. Because you might remember before GA4 was it, those 4 options were broken out at all
Right.
times. They didn't slide in and out the way they do now.
Yeah.
And then people would click on them. So I think that was probably a UI mistake to have it like that.
Right.
But again, this is probably what it's going to be. I mean, honestly, I hope they don't change UI too much, because every time they do, I have to go back and re-record all my training videos.
That,
So,
or if you're like me and you're on a client call and you're like, well, let's go into the admin section with those handy dandy 3 columns. Oh, no, those aren't 3 columns anymore. They're now 2 rows of vertical menu items. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not the surprise I wanted.
I was doing a training in Australia. And so the training this is fairly late in the day in Australia. So it was, overnight. And so suddenly the interface changed, because usually it changes, overnight in North America time. So it's like, I am literally training right now. Although the first few slides of every training I do is what you see right now might be different tomorrow or an hour from now. So please, let's just keep that in mind. You're going to get the deck afterwards, but
this second.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In this very moment, we are going to see a change to this report that I'm trying to train you on. Mm-hmm.
Every refresh is making you like, PTSD, like, oh, don't do it again.
Yeah, it's delightful.
But back to what we were saying. So I like to kind of think of these as being gradations. You said that the advertising reports, fairly static. Let's now go into the regular reports menu item. Let's talk a bit about, I know that you're known for saying that the information is all there. As a matter of fact, there's maybe even more information than there was in UA as far as what you can select on dimensions and metrics. But you've got to go get it. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think people really miss that there's less individual options on the left, but that drop down for dimension is packed with information. Yep. And whereas each of those reports would be broken out in Universal Analytics, and actually there'd be less reports in Universal Analytics than what you can get in that dimension dropdown. So, and if people are listening, they don't know what I'm talking about, open up any report, like go to user acquisition under lifecycle acquisition, or find a report like that. That first drop down that has your dimensions, and dimensions are, the text pieces, versus metrics, which are the numbers.
Things
so that dimension drop down, that dimension drop down has lots of stuff in there, and you can add a secondary dimension. And if you customize the report, which you can do by clicking the little pencil icon at the top right, then you can save a custom version of the report with dimensions and secondary dimensions, not just the primary ones, but you can add on a secondary and save that report the way you want it to. And I think that is a feature that is massively, underutilized maybe. People aren't aware of it. For sure, especially like saving a report with a secondary dimension. I feel like that is new, and I don't know exactly when it happened. I just noticed when I was making reports one day that it saved the secondary dimension. Like, oh, that's cool. And I didn't even think about it being a feature when it came out, but great, I could use that. And I think that that's something where people don't realize, like, if your site doesn't have revenue, go in and change your reports to remove the total revenue column. Right. Also annoying that GA4 assumes everyone has an e-commerce site. I agree. Yes. I wish I could remove the purchase conversion for sites that don't have purchases, but we can't.
No,
cool.
That one's stuck.
So again, it's just like, why are they forcing us to do this? There's choices that are made in that way. Like, I wish there was a checkbox when you set up a report and it's like, will this property ever receive revenue data? Yes, no. You click no, it won't give you the monetization reports. It won't put total revenue on every single report. That'd be great, but that's not how it is right now. But just remove those things, and I think that that's something where, as well, when you're thinking about the kinds of reports, like GA4 does give you a lot of data. There's a lot more data that you can put in. And one resource I really love, by the way, when you're working with custom reports, is data.ga4spy.com. It's a list of every single dimension and metric in GA4 and where you can use it, because you can't access everything in all places either.
Correct.
Which again is like weird choices. Like there's a metric called exits, which you can only access in the explore section. Why only there? I don't know. That's just how it is. Or like some things you can't get in Looker Studio, or some things you can't get in filters, but you can get them in reports. It's just, that part doesn't make any sense. That is the sort of weirdness of, why is this choice made? Why have you removed, like, why can't I put exits in regular reports, but I can put them in explorers? They'd be great in a, landing page report, for example, but I have to remake it in explorations. I don't know why.
I mean, I think that over time, many of us can kind of get comfortable with the order of things. But I agree with you. There will be some things where we kind of end up at that place. I remember when I was a kid, I would often get to that point in the conversation with mom and dad, and the answer that would come back to my question is just because. So I think, mom or dad Google is at some point just going to say exits just because.
Yeah. I also
just
wonder
go
too
ahead.
if it is a resource issue, though. I do wonder if there was issues where, the timeline maybe for releasing GA4 was pushed up, and maybe that's why some stuff felt a little less baked than it should have been. I mean, we don't know everything that happened
Hey,
behind
we
the
still
scenes
don't have
in the GA4
annotations.
release.
So yes, they
I don't
were.
think we're getting them, just FYI. Yes, apparently they were
Okay.
very underused in UA by anyone other than agencies. And unfortunately, agencies appear to only be a small percentage of the people who overall used UA.
Okay.
So I don't know if we're getting annotations. But I did
So
publish a blog post on my website about how to get UA annotations out of UA. If you haven't done that yet, make sure to do that if you were using them.
right. Deadline coming up, folks.
Yeah, don't
July
forget.
1st, 2024.
Please don't leave UA exporting data off until like the end of June, like you left putting off setting up GA4. Please.
Public service announcement.
Yeah.
The reports, just to finish on those. So we can definitely customize them. I got thrown a little bit because it throws a message up saying something like, would you like to replace the current report or would you like to save this?
Yeah. My rule of thumb is, did you make more than 2 changes? Then just save it as a new report. You can always just remove the default report out of the navigation, keep it existing in the reporting library, and then just swap it out if you need to. I just like having that stuff because maybe later you're going to want to be like, what was in the default user acquisition report? Or if you're like me, you're going to have a standard GA4 that you just set up and don't touch ever. Don't make any changes to it so you can see what the default stuff is.
And I'm so glad you brought up that report library. I would have thought that I could go back into the reports menu and look for it. No. Dana, where is the library?
It should be at the bottom of your reporting menu.
And it is, but that's not where I would have put it. So it's below all the rest.
I would have put it under maybe settings. I don't know. But this is a question. Like I look at it, I'm like, where is a good place for it? Unclear. Maybe up at the top with report snapshot in real time, maybe library should be the third option there. That might be an option. I mean, what I also don't see a menu option for, which you should have, is insights, which are really only accessible by going to the report snapshot and then scrolling down, which feels like a weird place to stick them.
Yeah. So those library reports, just so people can know, this is very handy if, let's say, you work on behalf of someone who doesn't know GA4 nearly as well as you, and they just want a report. I feel free to have your opinion, Dana. I would just say, make that customized report for them. Show them where it is down in that library. That's the one place they'll go in.
Well, I would actually customize the reports menu. I wouldn't make them go into the library. I would customize the reports menu. I would create a collection, and I would call the collection, Cheryl, only look at this. Like, no one else knows what your collections are called other than you. You don't need to use fancy business names. You could use you call them whatever you want. The only people who know are like you and Google and God. It's fine. And so call those collections whatever you want. Add the reports and they're going to make sense. And so absolutely, I've named collections like, Tom, this is for you, because I know that this client, Tom, is not necessarily very technically sophisticated, but he will go to a link that I direct him to. And because the reporting menu changes for everybody, not just you or not just your client or your boss or whoever, make sure that you have those collections that make sense for individuals. And if there's one place you want, your boss or whoever your client to look at, just name it after them. Put it in all caps if you need to, and then put the reports you need to see in that collection. And then that's it. And then, if they wander off and look at something else, that's on them.
No, and that's their own problem. I think that's great. It's just even knowing that the nav could be customized with a collection, right? This is the kind of thing that if Google had it to do all over again, that kind of communication would probably have made those stickers of yours something that were loved and not crossed out.
Yeah, I think honestly, we're changing the reporting interface, that reporting menu, is probably one of the best features of GA4, because in Universal Analytics, you would have had to create a custom report and you couldn't
Yep.
have it in the navigation. So it was in a different spot. I think that is probably one of the best parts of GA4. And it is, people don't necessarily realize the power behind the library section. And I don't know if it's necessarily well designed yet. I think that probably will have some changes, but I think it's one of my favorite parts of GA4 if I had to pick a spot.
You'd mentioned explore earlier. So take us into explorations. If we haven't found what we're looking for using what we've talked about thus far, what can explorations do?
Yeah, explorations is the more in-depth viewing of your data, where they have a few different, they call them techniques. Things like freeform is just, a table or a chart. And then we have things like segment overlaps, where you're looking at, say, mobile and desktop, or people who are mobile and desktop, or the path analysis, which is one I use a lot, or the funnel, and funnels can be added actually to the reporting menu. They don't just have to live under Explore. So these are more in-depth pieces. And actually in Explore, there's a setting in the admin that always freaks people out. And that's under, I think it's data collection. And so, no, it's not. I'm looking at it right now. It's under data retention. And so it says event data retention, 14 months. People think that means that your data is going to be gone from GA4 from 14 months. No, that means that the data you would see in explorations, like more in-depth data that you can look at, will be gone after 14 months. So that's why you need to hook up BigQuery if you need to do that. But in most cases, people are really only digging back 14 months anyway. And when you first set up a property, the default is 2 months. So right now, go into your admin under data collection and modification, click on data retention, make sure that event data retention says 14 months, not 2 months. Hit save.
Amen.
You're welcome.
Delivering value, Dana. Delivering value.
Every day.
So, explorations, deeper view. I agree with you on that. And there are some areas where explorations, I think, does a Venn diagram overlap with some of the other ways that you can use the same analytics data that you have, but you can use it in a data warehouse and in a visualization tool. You know where I'm going with this, but you know what? Before we talk about that, we're going to take a really quick break. I'll step away to address one thing that's been missing from Funnel Reboot: the ability to access the text of any show. I'm glad to finally announce that the podcast is now fully searchable and copyable thanks to the transcript feature in YouTube. Yes, YouTube. Now, even though the last 165 shows are audio only, they are all on YouTube. Go on to YouTube, head to Funnel Reboot's channel, and on the channel's masthead page, click the magnifying glass and search away. And while you're there, please consider subscribing to get future shows. There will be even more to say on transcripts in the coming days, but I'm pleased this capability is now available. Okay, now let's get back to the show. So Dana, we were talking earlier, and I had said right at the outset that I thought if we look at Universal Analytics as a really good front-end reporting tool sitting with a somewhat weaker back-end data model, I like to think about GA4 as being the reverse. It is a robust data model that has right now a front end reporting, a reporting piece that, may not be able to do it for all of us. So like, if that's being true, I think what we have to acknowledge though is that Google has tools outside of GA4 that might cut the mustard for those cases that don't necessarily fit within GA4's reports, right? The data does sit outside the tool as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, for example, a lot of our client reports are built in Looker Studio, which works great with GA4 data. I would say that one of the things that I use Looker Studio for the most has actually been added to GA4, and that's calculated metrics. And so you should see calculated metrics now under your custom definitions section in the admin. And what I use that for the most is on most of the websites that we work with, we capture something called content consumption. And I'll give you the link to that so you can include it in the show notes.
Sweet.
But content consumption is a Google Tag Manager recipe or WordPress plugin or that we add to websites where it looks at not just how someone viewed the page. That's nice. Did they spend long enough on the page to actually read the content on the page? And did they scroll down to the bottom of the content? If both those things are true, then we would say that the content is consumed. And so what I always like to know is what percentage of views were dwelling time, like did they spend long enough on the page, did they scroll to the bottom, and then consumed. And then that way that tells me, are people actually engaging with this page or engaging with my content the way that I want them to? Are they just, hoarding the tab for later? Are they skimming? Did they just bail entirely? And that's a really interesting metric for clients to see, because it is kind of sad how few pieces of content actually get read in full. But we have some big beefy posts on our website, like some of them take 20 minutes to read, and people do read the whole thing. And sometimes it's even as high as like 15% of the people with any page view. But that's a pretty high metric for content consumption. And because I like to present that content consumption metric as a percentage, it isn't something that I could present in the native GA4 interface. I have to go to Looker Studio. Now we have calculated metrics, so I can actually create a calculated metric that is, number of times this event fired divided by the number of views. And that's something that's really valuable and is helping us keep more things in GA4. But again, sometimes too, with Looker Studio, sometimes you just want to have a really simple, basic report, especially if you're reporting to like a client or your boss. You want to keep it super simple. You don't want them to get distracted. I know that sometimes people can get nervous and they're like, well, I want them to see the value I bring to this job, so I'm going to give them 80-page reports. Like, nobody wants that. We're not getting paid by the pound here. And so I think it's important to really cut back on the amount of information that you present. And Looker Studio is the best way to do that, because they're not going to click around and look at other stuff. So really keep in mind, who's the audience for this? Is giving them access to GA4 or letting them see reports in GA4 the right solution? Or instead, should we make them a Looker Studio report that just has, one chart per page, so they can stay focused on that one decision that they have to make?
Sure. And I imagine that most of the people listening have heard of Looker Studio. Dana is right on the money with these, that in terms of giving it to users, if you haven't tried that, it is something that is friendly that way for them, meaning that you can send them a link. You can have it create a PDF that gets sent to them. You can have them going in and having certain controls on it. And it is quite friendly for the recipient of that dashboard or report, compared to you, for example, handing them over a Google Sheet that has a chart within it, but then they can start to parse through all the numbers and, ask you questions that will just suck up all of your time.
Yeah, and I think, we have our rules for reporting, which is you shouldn't need to be there to explain the report. The report should be able to be picked up by anyone and understood. So we include a lot of text on our reports. And the other thing too is you need to think about, who's going to be viewing this and on what device. And one of the things that is nice about Looker Studio is you control the size of the canvas of the report. Yes. So if we know that, this guy's going to look at his report only on his iPad, and she is only ever going to look at reports on her iPhone, I know how big that size is going to be. So we're going to make a report that fits on your phone without having to, do a lot of pinch and zooming. And that way you can be, and really I approach this from an agency perspective, but this is true of in-house people too, because a lot of our clients are in-house teams. Yep. And what we're trying to do is, show them that you're being useful, because especially when you're thinking about leadership, they may not understand what you do at all. And if you're working in SEO or PPC, they're like, I don't know, I pay you money and maybe things happen. You need to prove your value. But proving your value isn't just in the number of leads that you have. It's also ensuring that you understand and are responsive to their needs, and that they can trust you to deliver. And so if you're giving a report that's, 80 pages, super confusing, yet another table, nobody likes tables. Only people who are actually data nerds like tables. Normal people do not enjoy them. They would like pretty charts, please and thank you. So less tables, more charts, and just respect their needs. And if they know they're only going to look at the stuff on the phone, then give them a report that's sized on the phone, and then they're not going to be annoyed at you every single time they try to open up the report and they have to pinch and zoom all over the place to see the data.
I think in many ways what it highlights is the need as marketers and people who do marketing analytics to do the exact same thing for our internal users as we know a website needs to do for external users, which is keep the user in mind. So going back to that cardinal sin that we've just talked about, handing them the Excel spreadsheet or the Google sheet, while we like to soak in those sheets and, we're so proud of that 5 hours that we just plowed into um, making that calculated field, for example.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we figured out how to do it for, I don't know, the last 60 days, and we broke it up by month. And, oh my
Yep.
goodness, we had, period over period change, and it was amazing. So while that is all good, I think we need to step back for a moment and realize there's actually some downsides to that spreadsheet.
Mm.
It is brilliant, no question. But one downside, where if you look at Looker Studio for a moment, you realize, oh, we could make that a calculated field, and they could change the date range, and that calculated field, poof, will correctly show what it is for that period they care about.
Mhm.
You can't have that over on your spreadsheet. That will break your spreadsheet.
Mhm.
So it's that kind of consideration, I, I suppose I should call it. It's
Yeah,
like
and I think
we're little UX people ourselves.
yeah, absolutely. I think if you haven't read any UX books or hang out with UX communities, I think certainly everyone should be well served by doing that, no matter your role anywhere. But I think part of it too is also that you don't need to show the complexity for people to appreciate what you do. It takes a lot of work to make something incredibly simple. And while like
Mm,
I am an Android person through and through, but there is something to be said for iPhones and the amount of
right.
simplicity they brought to the
I
market.
get it.
I was a big BlackBerry user, and then
Yep.
when the iPhone came out, I was like, "Who's going to use this? This is silly." The answer is everyone, because they made it very simple, and it's,
Yeah.
right? It's we didn't
Yeah.
know what was going to happen, but I think that what they nailed it was that it's an incredibly complex piece of hardware and software, but they don't need you to see that it's complex in order for you to appreciate it. When you look at something like a BlackBerry or the early Android phones where they were like, "Look how nerdy this is," like, "Please pat me on the head and because I've showed you how nerdy this is." People don't actually care. You might
Yeah.
care,
Yeah.
but there are ways to express that without having to think about it. And I think that that's where you can really get hung up with the technological interestingness of it.
Yeah.
Like when I present analytics plans to clients, like some of them are actually super into it and they have questions and they want to know like how is this recorded and how does this work? And other ones are just like, okay, cool. So my business goals, we always start with business goals. What are your overall business goals? And then we break that down into KPI and the metrics and then we think about what do we actually need to measure? And then that becomes the analytics plan. So when I'm presenting that to the client, I'm not saying, we're going to record this thing because this is really neat or whatever it might be. We'll say things like, we know that SEO is really important to you. And so we're making sure to record core web vitals values on every single page so that we have data that's more extensive than what Google gives us in Google Search Console. End of
Yep.
sentence.
Yep.
Right? We don't have to be like, and it takes this Google Tag Manager library, and what it does is it runs on every single page, and then we have these 5 custom metrics with these extra parameters. They do not care. And it's like sometimes I'm like, but I just want balloons to release from the ceiling. I get that. I figured out something particularly difficult in Tag Manager. I get that desire to have like a woo-woo moment, but it's not going to come from people who aren't your peers because they don't get it and they're not going to get it. And that's okay.
We can keep that simplicity that we're going for with them in our mind, and that we can also hold on to the fact that this is complex and
Hmm.
keep that in our mind. And we know what that delta is. We knew how much we needed to simplify it. And that's really what they pay us for. So,
Hmm.
I
Simplification and
think,
honesty, I think, are like your two,
right?
North Stars when it comes to this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So just on that complexity though, because you
Hmm.
mentioned BigQuery before. So let's just back up.
Hmm.
Let's imagine that the scenario you were talking about with Looker Studio was you
Hmm.
had just connected it directly to GA4. And
Yeah.
let's also imagine that we weren't heavy users of it because of
Hmm.
those nasty things called quota limits. So
Hmm.
we in this scenario though are now understanding a client where we are also bringing in non-Google sources of information. Maybe we have
Hmm.
LinkedIn ads, we have ads from Meta, we
Hmm.
have Quora, Reddit, whatever you want.
Yeah.
And we're trying to figure out how to bring that information into the fold because let's say they're spending on advertising with those and we're an agency and they want to
Hmm.
know what they're getting for it.
Yep.
How might BigQuery help out here?
Well, it's like there's a huge leap from these UI tools like GA4 to something like BigQuery. It is an
Yes.
enormous leap. And I just want to make sure I'm not overstating that, because I think that people are like, I'll just use BigQuery. It's like a big spreadsheet. It is for some data sources, but not for GA4. And the other thing about BigQuery is that if you have a report that uses BigQuery as a data source and you have more than like one person checking that on a weekly basis, it's going to get real expensive real fast, because you have to pay when you pull data out of BigQuery. And so it just keep that in mind. It's going to get expensive. So if you feel like you need to go down the BigQuery path, you are going to have to learn BigQuery properly. And you're not just going to ever want to connect to direct, like don't set up the BigQuery to GA4 connection and then directly pull that data from BigQuery into Looker Studio. You're going to have to do things to the data in Looker
Yeah.
Studio to
And
cut
hand
down
that
what you're
dashboard out
reporting.
to 20 people. Yeah. Don't
Yeah.
do that.
Don't do that. So I would say like a good gateway is actually Supermetrics, which I know can be expensive, but if you need multiple data sources in Looker Studio, like LinkedIn ads, like Facebook ads, etc., Supermetrics is a good way to get started, because they do have all those different data sources. It is slow. Any non-native built-in Google data source is slower than the native ones, of course, because Google, but it is a good way to get started. And I think that once you get comfortable with that and you think, okay, we need something else, we need to start building data pipelines, which would be multiple sources of data piping, hence the name, into BigQuery, which you then pull into your reports. Then you can start to get into land of BigQuery. The product we use for that is called Airbyte. And there's two different options for Airbyte. If you have someone in your team who knows Docker and is familiar with those kinds of products, you can actually host it yourself for free. It's open source. Or you can pay for their cloud product, and then that will get the data into BigQuery for you. And then the other side is getting the data, doing stuff with it, the transforms with it in BigQuery. So you have a smaller version of the table that just has data you need. So you're not spending $1 billion every time you open up your Looker Studio dashboard. And then at that point, you're going to have to learn something like this technology called DBT. There's other possible options out there, but that's where you're starting to get into code land. And so I think that a lot of people are sort of straddling those two worlds, and they're like, well, I don't actually want to learn SQL. I don't want to learn DBT, but I do need to pull in data from multiple sources. And I think Supermetrics does a decent job of sort of filling that gap. But if you do want to learn BigQuery and GA4 specifically, which is GA4's BigQuery implementation is a little bit complex, to be honest. There's an excellent course on teamsimmer.com, which is Simo Ahava's learning platform. They have a course on BigQuery and GA4. I strongly recommend it. It is excellent.
Johan van der Bergen. It's a great one.
Yeah, Johan's course is fantastic. And Johan also has a website. I think it's GA4 and BigQuery or something like that. Yeah. And that's also great. And he has a membership to that, and he publishes recipes and whatnot. So you don't need to write your own SQL. But you can also work with, ChatGPT to help you write SQL if you're stuck.
You can. Or where I see this sometimes coming in is in an in-house team. If you have IT resources and they have been accustomed to building data warehouses and pushing data back and forth with other systems inside your company, maybe working with them and acting as the subject matter expert, telling them what these fields mean, they'll be like, hey, great. Google now has a tool for this. Well, it's about time. And right. They'll just jump right in, because there are people with decades of experience in these same things. I hate to tell marketers this, but we're kind of late to the party.
And I think part of it too is, it's because analytics isn't necessarily their full-time job, right? You're an SEO person and you also have to do reports. You're a PPC person and you also have to do reports. So having to toss like learning BigQuery on top of that is a lot, which I get, which is why some people, there's two camps, right? There's I can do anything I want, so I'm going to learn BigQuery and do this crazy report. And there's the people who are like, I just need a friggin' report. Let me have a report, please.
I'd like to go home at some point.
I just want to have a life, or maybe they're like, what, this is not of interest to me at all, which I also get, is that, it's just not, BigQuery is not something everybody wants to learn, and that's fine. And so I think it's you decide what camp you're in, but then know that these are the different resources and different choices that you're going to have to make based on that. I know,
and it's there.
Like BigQuery, but that's not for everybody, and that's okay.
Yeah, to have that option and then politely turn that option down in favor of others. I mean, another one, which may work for some people, is the Google Sheets extension called Google Analytics for Report Builder. Does a fairly decent job of some basic stuff, and uses all those things you were talking about with dimensions and metrics.
Yeah, and one thing it does really nicely is that if you're having an issue where you load up your reports and you're seeing these issues with like quota limit exceeded, it means that basically too many people are looking at your GA4 data at one time. One trick that I have is if you are building a brand new report, I recommend setting the default time range to be 1 day so that you're not completely overwhelming the system. And there is a pause updates option. That's at the top right of Looker Studio. Always use that when you're building new stuff. The other thing I do a lot in my Looker Studio reports is I'll have the first page just be like an information page, no data is loaded, and then the client would navigate to the specific
Yes.
page they want to view so we're not overwhelming quotas. So don't start off your first page with like the last 12 months because you're going to run out of quotas real quick. But
Yes.
you can also use this spreadsheet tool that will pull data into Google Sheets for you. You can also use the extract data source in Looker Studio, which essentially you set up your GA4 data source and you set up the extract data source, which then pulls data from the other data source. It's like that yo dog joke. I heard you like data sources, so I put a data source, your data source. So you can do the data source. But yeah, and the only downside of extract data is there is a limit to the size of it. So eventually we'll just like stop working and it doesn't warn you in advance. It just happens. So there's a couple of different options that you can do there. But the Supermetrics GA4 connector also does a very good job of dealing with quotas. There is some caching built into that connector. And so for clients who I know are going to hit quotas, we'll sometimes use the Supermetrics connector instead.
Yeah.
Instead of going to BigQuery.
And I think even for the non-technical among us, this notion of how much am I asking for, right? Like when I walk into a library and the librarian says, what would you like to know about? And I say the subject, and then I add, and bring me every book, map, article, compendium, and other audio recording that you have on that subject. Just plunk
and
it
you're
here
going
on
to
this
have to
table.
pay the librarian.
Yeah.
They bring you. That's
right.
BigQuery.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is it. We're all, again, big boy, big girl pants. We're all understanding that data has value. Data also, when it needs to move from A to B, has a cost of transportation. So we have to start thinking in those terms because quotas are now part of our life, and it's like, well, that's okay. If you think it through, you realize they kind of have to be.
Yeah. I mean, and I can only imagine the amount of money that Google is going to save starting in August 2024 when they dump all the old UA data. I'm sure that there's some universal analytics properties that haven't been used since 2006 and just sitting there all this time costing Google money for storage.
Yeah. And I mean, you said it earlier with, what we're setting up to tag, what we're doing as far as making our goals for our business. The data is there in furtherance of our business goal. It's not there to fill up our attic and our garage and our basement.
Like
but
no
we
one's
treat
setting
it
up
like
an
that.
analytics account for funsies. No.
Yeah, no, right? So
that's the reason.
and so now that we have something that is this customizable, some tough questions need to be asked, but those questions are ones that later on you will be glad because that data will be just the way you want it, and it will be able to guide the person towards the decision they wanted to make. You just have to think of all that now. So
it's the pre-anticipation. So I mean, ideally, sometimes you have to make a report in a hurry. Sometimes you don't. If you're in the luxury space where you don't have to make the report in a hurry, start planning that report as early as you can in the project. I often will start sketching out reports when we first start working with a client, just listening to them. And then that really helps you at the end. Don't make the report, the day of, unless it's absolutely unavoidable. But really start thinking in advance and use the words the client uses. Try to reflect their language back to them. All good things to do when you're working with someone.
Yes, and let's take that very thing you said and flip it around for a moment here. If I am the client and I'm talking with the agency, instead of just rolling my eyes, they didn't get it right again. What kinds of practices can you encourage those in-house people to have when they're coming together with the people who are giving them those reports? Like, what are my ads getting for me? What would you suggest, knowing now what we know, that they can bring to the table so that this process is a little less painful?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake I see is, some leadership got it in their heads at some point that this metric is the metric, and UA was bounce rate. Bounce rate is garbage. In GA4, you have engagement rate. Engagement rate is better, but I would say, there isn't just one metric that can be like the one metric to rule them all. You really have to be responsive and think about what is the question I have? What are the KPIs? What are the metrics? It's not going to be the same for every single one of your questions. And remember as well that you really want to make sure that your goals are smart, going back to classic, how to set goals. But
Sure.
there's a lot of not smart goals out there, like build brand awareness. What does that mean? How will you know when you got there? How are we going to measure that? So by giving your agency goals that are actually, maybe you can't, make them smart, you can't make them fully smart, or you're missing their SMRT or whatever it might be, right? Like,
Right.
as long as you've got 3 or 4 of 5 smart letters, really try to make those goals easier on them, because then they actually feel like they have something that they can achieve. And nothing stops people from getting excited about a goal faster than giving them a goal that they can't possibly achieve. It feels like a trap. So,
Yeah.
when you're working with those agencies, or, if you're in leadership and you're working with your in-house team and you're like, why did they hate this? Well, maybe you gave them a really difficult goal or unclear goal. And so that's why you're not getting what you wanted, because you weren't able to make it clear in the first place. And if you can't make it clear, tell them that you can't make it clear, and ask them what they would suggest to make this goal clearer as well. Because I think that would also really help to have that outside perspective.
When I've done that, I've found that they make it more granular, and it's also surprising. Sometimes they make the target number that is set for it more aggressive than I would have.
And then I always want to know why, especially with companies where you're like, will you actually be able to serve this many clients?
Right.
Do you have like your techs? You're talking about a home services business, your techs are already fully booked up. What makes you think that if we get you 20% more business, you're actually going to be able to help those people? Or are you just going to piss off 20% more people because they couldn't actually get your services? Right. So there's also, a responsibility at your end to put, if you can, sometimes you just can't because you need the job and you can't afford to annoy anyone. But if you can push back and say, like, I don't think this is a good idea because of this, then I think it's also important to outline that stuff. It's one time we had a client where we set up CallRail for them, the call tracking solution.
Yep.
And it turns out that one of the reasons why they weren't converting a lot of phone calls is because no one was answering the phone.
Yeah, that'll
we didn't
do it.
know until we set up CallRail, and it said these calls were all abandoned. We're like, what is going on? And it turns out that the people who are supposed to be answering at their locations they're busy. So like, okay, well, now we need to talk
They
about
just let it
sort of
ring.
central answering system. We need to figure this out, because you're basically throwing money away on paid ads where people are calling and it's going to voicemail, and so they're hanging up. And so those kinds of things you can only find out once you really start to dig in and be like, all right, so why do you want more phone calls? Oh, actually, that isn't the problem at all. But that's where that conversation can lead you to.
Yeah, I'm kind of hearing, they said in like Toyota and places like that, they would use this 5 whys, right? Well, why?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, why is that? And
Yeah.
it sounds like, you're getting to ground truth here. And I'll rephrase what I think you were saying by putting it, if the client and the agency are both truly interested in the truth, then they will both welcome the other one, looking over their cubicle wall and saying, oh, but is that really what you want? And if you kind of can get that easy common language there, if you can both open yourselves, be vulnerable to talking a little bit about how the other one does their business, I think that's how you'll get to that ground truth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And also remember that people love talking about themselves. So if you can get people to do that and be like, one of the questions we ask people is, tell us about your best day of work ever.
Yeah.
And that really helps sort of open them up. And it also tells you a lot about who they are as a person. What did they treasure? Like, what was their best day, and why did that make that their best day? That'll tell you a lot about them.
100%. Well, I can tell you that I've had a really good day figuring out how Google Analytics is going to make some of the stuff that we need to do better. Dana, if people want to find out more about the ways that you explain GA, where would you send them?
Yeah. So my website, the learning platform I publish on is kpplaybook.com. And right now we have a course, Analytics for Agencies, which is everything that we do at my agency for analytics projects: sell them, deliver them, implement them, all of it. Nothing is held back. Plus office hours with me, plus a community. So use the code Funnel Reboot to get 20% off your purchase. And you can also, I would say the social platform I'm most active on is LinkedIn. So that's kpplaybook.com, and find me, Dana DiTomaso, on LinkedIn.
And we will have both those in the show notes. Dana, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
You helped us find better ways to make our marketing even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter @Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.